It is good to see you this evening. If you're expecting an outline, there isn't one. As mentioned in the bulletin, I'm going to just simply answer one question. It's not a simple one, I guess you'd say, in the minds of many people. But instead of looking at the book of John, which would have been difficult to do in a brief fashion, so next Sunday be prepared for a little lengthier lesson. But as we have faced this last week the death of one of our loved ones, Thomasine Rybert, it was noted during the memorial, I don't think it was mentioned, but her family, of course, mentioned it, that she was cremated. And that has occurred before with members of the congregation. And at that time, the question arose, several people asked me, is it scriptural for a Christian to be cremated? And along with that, there are times many questions pertaining not only to necessarily the disposal of the body, and I hope I don't offend anybody. I was trying to figure out the best way to say it, but I don't really know any better way to say it than disposing of the body, because that is what we do in one fashion or another. So I'm not trying to degrade it or diminish the importance of what we do, but I really don't know much better way to say it. But there are questions that arise. You know, I have at times through the years had lengthy conversations with people about death, dying, what happens, and what should be done upon one's death. So this fits right in with that. And I am going to try and be brief. I could simply say, is it unscriptural for a Christian to be cremated? Say no and sit down. But I don't think that would suffice. I don't think it would satisfy many people, so we're not going to do that. But we need to look at it and ask some questions. First of all, is there Bible legislation? We talk about authority. Colossians 3 and verse 17. You know, God has specified that there are things that we are to do within His authority. There is specific authority given. For example, many people look at the Lord's church and they say, well, you know, you people are really odd because you don't have a mechanical instrument of music. Well, no, people are odd because they do, because God specified we're to worship Him in spirit and in truth, John 4, verse 23 and 24. But then regarding the music in worship, He didn't say just make music, He said sing. And so we have specific legislation on what to do. There is no authority whatsoever for adding a mechanical instrument of music. And that's why we don't do it. It's a matter of authority. So what is it that God has said regarding the disposal of the body? Is there specifics that He has given? Or is it just generic? That, you know, if, and you have to even realize this, if you have the body, because not in all circumstances do you. Is there legislation given as to the disposal of it? And the answer is no. From the creation until God speaks to Abraham, you don't even find burial mentioned. In Genesis 15, God tells Abraham, you will be buried in a good age. In other words, you're going to live long, and you'll be buried. It simply means interred. Doesn't give any indication as to the means of that being done. Whenever you do find, for example, Abraham, or Abraham as he came to be known, you find him buried, you find that he was placed in a cave in Machpelah. Previous to that, Sarah had been placed there, but you find in Genesis 23 that he was placed in a cave. You find in Genesis the 35th chapter, in verse 8, Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died, and she was buried beneath Bethel under an oak. I would assume that that's what we normally speak of as burying somebody. You dig a grave site, and the body is placed there. There are times at which a body was burned. Saul and Jonathan, whenever the Philistines killed them, they cut their heads off. They desecrated the body. Those who found that out they found Saul and Jonathan's body. They took them back and they burned them and then gathered the bones. In Amos, the 6th chapter, as Amos talks about the penalty that's going to come upon the northern kingdom because of their sin, he talks about how, of course, they would be taken into captivity. Amos, the 6th chapter, emphasizes the captivity they're going to go into. But in verse 10, it talks about the death of people within a house, and that the one that burneth them will take them out, take that body out. And so there again is an instance of what we would call cremation, or burning of the remains. You find Jesus was placed in a tomb or a sepulcher. We talk about the burial of Jesus Christ, but his body was taken and put into a tomb or sepulcher that was hewn into the stone. So it wasn't seemingly a natural place. It was a place that was cut out. You can still go to that part of the country, and because of the terrain and such, you will find that there are tombs that are many different places that are cut out into the stone to place the body there. And so you find those various ways. And then you talk even about that, what about the care of the body whenever it's finished? Somebody says, what about embalming? What does God say about that? Well, not a whole lot. You find that whenever you get to Jacob died, but in order to have the body where they could carry it out of Egypt later, it was instructed that he be embalmed. In other words, his body be preserved. But that wasn't the normal fashion. You find that God has much to say in the Old Testament about touching a dead body. And of course, we realize his law said it, and so they would bury a person quickly, or they would burn the body. And that was wisdom of God. They might not have understood it, but the prevention of the spread of contagion. So we know that, for example, whenever you have a disaster strike, Haiti was struck by a hurricane recently and had events such as that before. There's the problem. What do you do with the bodies? And many times the bodies have to be just pushed into a common grave quickly, but you have to do it because the body begins to decay. And embalming the body takes the means to preserve that body. But that wasn't the normal type of treatment of a body. The restoration of the body, Jesus, his body was wrapped in linen, as Lazarus was, and several others we speak of, but they were wrapped in linen. But this wasn't an embalming process. There was spice put upon the body and such as that, but it was an embalming, and we know that because you look over in John the 11th chapter to Lazarus, and he was risen from the dead, and he came out, and they had to remove the wrappings from him. But the concern people had was when he told them to roll away the stone, said, he's been dead 4 days, and behold, he stinketh. In other words, decay has started. So it wasn't an embalming process at all, and the body begins to decay, and it is something that is the spread of disease. And even whenever Abram desired a place to bury Sarah, he said he wanted to do that so he could put the body from him. And we know that whenever a body dies, that decay sets in, and the body, you go to a funeral, if there is a funeral, and there is a viewing of the body, and people comment, Jack looks pretty natural. But many times you look and you say, well, a person dies, and it's hard to get them to look like we remember them. And that is really exemplified whenever Abram spoke about Sarah. He said, I need a place to put her body from me. He didn't want to see the decay. And that's part of the burial process and what it does. But whenever you look, you go over to the New Testament, and whenever you find in John 19:40, it talks about the disposing of the body and how it was wrapped and such as that. It says, as was the custom. Now, some customs were law, but generally it just meant that's the manner of way they did it. And so the Jews, that was their custom, but it wasn't a law. And so the point is, you look, and the Bible, as far as the means of disposal of the body, it's generic. There are principles we should have, respect. You know, Saul and Jonathan, whenever their bodies were taken and hanged in the place of Dagon, the idols and such, and they'd been beheaded, that was a treatment of the body that was disrespectful. And nobody would condone that. So anything that we do should show proper respect and regard for us as being created by God. God created the physical, but we need to look beyond. You know, you think about, what does the Bible say about this body? And that's what we're concerned with. What do you do with the body when death occurs? We need to realize, as James speaks about, the body apart from the spirit is dead. But you can go further than that. You look, Peter says that knowing that shortly I must put off my tabernacle, even as the Lord Jesus has showed me. So Peter knew that just as Jesus had told him about his death, he would do it. But notice how he phrased it. I shall put off this tabernacle. And Paul uses a similar wording in 2 Corinthians 5 whenever he talks about that if this earthly house of our tabernacle were dissolved, we have a building, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. And then he talks about in this we groan. You know, he talks about in there and several other instances the fact that I am in here. This isn't me. This is what you see of me, the outward self, the body, the shell, the tabernacle, in which I, my spirit, you know, whenever God created man, He placed in him that spirit. There is a soul within us that goes on. That differentiates us from the body lying on the side of the road, which is an animal. They don't have a soul. I do. I am that soul. I am housed in this tabernacle according to God. And so whenever the spirit leaves this body, what remains is, in essence, a husk. And, you know, again, we don't want to be disrespectful. We want to treat any of God's creation in a proper fashion, but especially us. You know, we are not an animal. We are humans created in the image of God. And so I look and I realize that this body, though it's important, I need to take care of it. You know, I need to honor God by the things that I do within this body, and thus I, my spirit, my soul, I control the body. I need to honor God in that. But once I depart from it, I'm gone. And this body remains. I realize a lot of people, that gets to the idea of, you know, what about the funeral itself? You know, what should be done? Well, whatever you want. As long as it's not violating God's will, as long as it shows proper honor to the person as you would have. You know, we don't want to go about like Saul and Jonathan, just tack somebody up. But the funeral itself, God doesn't speak of it. So what do you have? I've been asked that question many times. What should I do for a funeral? I say, what do you want to do? Some people say, I don't want a funeral. That's fine. There's nothing biblical that says you need to have a funeral. Others say, well, I just want to have a brief graveside service. I say, that's great, if that's what you want. But I encourage people to look to their family. You know, some people take great comfort and consolation in visiting a gravesite. They will go, and I know on, you know, Flag Day, they go and they will, many people call it Decoration Day, they go to the funeral, go to the gravesite, they will decorate, they'll care for, they'll do all of this. I'll admit, I'm not one of those people. I do not visit gravesites. My main interest in visiting a graveyard is if I want to go through and say, oh, this is, you know, down the road we've got one of the oldest cemeteries in Jackson County. I went down there once and just looked. I thought, well, this is fascinating. You know, you look at the dates on there and such as that. But as far as going and lamenting where my mother, my father, or some other ancestor has been, I don't get anything out of that. A lot of people do. Personal choice. But I look and I realize as I go through a graveyard, there are bodies that have been interred there to help people remember things. A lot of times people take great consolation. They take great care in setting up grave sites. They put up tombstones. They do all of these things. If that is personally what you want, there's nothing wrong with it. But for us to bind something because that's the way it's always been done or that's the way I feel is something far from what the Bible has said. Some people look and say, well, you know, if you cremate somebody, well, what about the resurrection? God has made plain that, you know, whenever you die, I don't care how you or I die. In Ecclesiastes, the 12th chapter, then shall the dust return to earth as it was, spirit shall return unto God who gave it. Remember, the spirit apart from the body is dead. This body is here, and it's going to return. It's going to decay, is what that is saying there. I don't care whether you were eaten by a lion, whether you perished in an explosion. You know, some years back, there was a great explosion over here off of 435. There were firemen who got out there. The trailer exploded. The fire trucks themselves were disintegrated, let alone the bodies of those men. Well, we can perish in a fire. You could be at the bottom of the sea. You know, Robert and Christine were over in Hawaii, and likely they went over there and looked. I believe it's the USS Arizona. You know, here's a memorial set. Bodies went down, and they stayed down. Well, what about those bodies? You know, we could talk about what happened to the bodies if they're below the sea for a while. What about people that might perish in a volcanic explosion? What about people, you have something wrong, you have a leg amputated. You know that the means of disposing of amputated limbs, incineration. What about that? What's God going to do? Can He piece together this puzzle is really the way that people look at it. But God, He talks about the resurrection, and He talks about the fact, I believe in a bodily resurrection. The body, He says, that we are in will be raised, but it's going to be changed. Paul emphasizes that we're going to have a new body. Burial, cremation, being lost in a storm at sea, being lost in a fire, being in the midst of an explosion, none of these are going to make one whit of difference whenever God, at that last time, He sends forth the call and the dead in Christ rise, and then others rise, but the body is going to be changed in the twinkling of an eye because flesh and blood cannot inherit heaven. The body is changed, but God's taking care of that. Are we so skeptical of God's ability that we say, well, you know, those individuals who were put to death by fire, even if they died for God, too bad. They won't get the resurrection. And those who were cast into the den of lions, too bad. They're not going to be in part of the resurrection. Are we so skeptical of God's abilities that we would hold that? Whenever He Himself said that all shall be raised. God's abilities are not hampered by what happens to this tabernacle in which I dwell. The Bible emphasizes more. You know, we look, and there's nothing wrong with questioning, what about? What happens when I die? What should I do? Should I have a funeral? Should I have a memorial? Should I be buried? Should I be put in a tomb? Should I be put in a crypt? Should I be cremated? Nothing wrong with answering those questions. But God, in His Word, He says your emphasis needs to be someplace else. Not that you don't ask those questions, but do you realize that throughout His Word, like I said, He doesn't talk about burial until Genesis 15. And then whenever burial is mentioned, it is a generic term that relates to so many different means in which it was done. What is he emphasizing then? How we live. That we ourselves, Titus 2:11, the grace of God that bringeth salvation has appeared unto all men, teaching us that denying ungodliness and worldly lust, we should live soberly, righteously, and godly in this present world. Why? Hebrews 9 and verse 27, it's appointed unto man once to die. We're going to die. And after that, what? The judgment. He doesn't say after that you have to decide what are you going to do in the burial. That's not the focus, the concern that we ought to have that permeates our life. It's a decision you and I have to make. But our focus is, how will I stand before the judgment? And so I prepare myself all through life not to have a specific type of burial, but to die in a certain way. Revelation 14 and verse 13, blessed are they which die in the Lord. I mean, here it is. I am dying. I am living and dying in a manner which is pleasing to God. And so like Paul's concern in 2 Timothy 4 wasn't, time my departure is at hand. Timothy, what are you going to do with my remains? You don't find that in there at all. He said, I've fought a good fight. I've finished my course. I've kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give unto me in that day, not to me only, but to all them that love his appearing. We live to die. The manner of life, the manner of death, needs to be in accord with God's will. The other things are incidental. Choose the way that you want. Discuss it with your family. If your family is attuned and, is there a financial consideration? Have you priced a funeral lately? Yeah, there is. But, be as it may, if you have a serious objection personally to the idea of cremation, tell your family you don't want to be cremated. And if it's a money thing, you will find a way to overcome that. But discuss it with your family, find out what you're comfortable with. But whenever I'm gone, I don't want my family dwelling on, well, should we have cremated him? Should we not have cremated him? Should we have had this at the funeral? Should we not have had this at the funeral? I want them to think, Hebrews 11th chapter, I want to be in their roll call of faith for the life I lived, not the burial I went through. God doesn't give any instructions. Here's what you need to do whenever you bury somebody. I leave that up to you. God left it up to us, so I'm not going to sit here and dictate any matter. But I will dictate, because God did. If you want to face the end of life with a certainty, you do like Paul. Finish your course. Keep the faith. And look to that crown God gives you. If you're here tonight and you're not a child of God, you need to realize, as we spoke of, Hebrews 9, you will die. There's no doubt about that. Every single one of us, we will leave this earthly body. There will be a resurrection. But the resurrection is unto judgment. What are you and I doing to get ready for that? If you're not prepared tonight, you have the opportunity to leave and say, like Paul, I'm ready to be offered. Live that life because you choose God. If we can help you to do that, let's do it as we stand and sing the song of invitation.